Chapter 17. The exhaustion was overwhelming. Months, if not years, of trying to connect with my husband had taken its toll. I had poured myself into him, and all my energy had been sucked into a black hole. I desperately wanted to hide and stay away from all the comments and questions that I knew were just around the corner. I couldn't face them. Sleep was the only solution. Alice understood and distracted the kids when she wasn't working, so I could lie in bed and cry. Once Paul announced that he was coming out of hospital, I asked him to take anything he wanted from the house and find somewhere else to live. I needed to return home and to start my life again. He came and took the computer, the microwave, the TV, and said he would be back for his car when he was allowed to drive again. All the items that had any monetary value were gone. I was so relieved. Each of those things were so strongly connected to Paul, and the house felt lighter once they were out. The computer was the only concern because I knew that I would need to start up my studies again and finally finish off my neglected counseling degree so I could get some work. The computer also meant contact with friends and family around the globe. Thankfully, I didn't have to worry. My neighbor across the street was happy to sell me a computer, and he knew I didn't have any money. My new computer cost me a dozen freshly baked rock buns, Rod's favorite trait. His wife, Jeanette, asked me if I wanted to do some house cleaning for them a couple of hours a week for some extra cash. I was being looked after. We would be all right. I was relieved to be back home in our gingerbread house. The bloodstains on the couch and the missing knife from my wooden block in the kitchen were the only signs that anything bad had happened. The kids didn't even ask where Abba was. As my first Friday back home approached, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I no longer had to ask Paul to drive us and have him say that he didn't want to go. I could do it myself. I just had to face my fear of city traffic. I told the kids we were going to Chinatown for dinner. They were thrilled. It was hard to get there on the bus from the hills with a pram. Now that I could drive, Friday nights at the Central Markets in Chinatown for dinner became our new little family's weekly ritual. I loved chatting to all the different stallholders. Most of them remembered me from when I would come in with Asher on the train as a baby and just walk around and chat. This quickly became our favorite part of the week, and often we would leave early afternoon and stay till bedtime. Having the car meant a whole new world opening up for us, and requests started coming in from different friends. Naomi, one of the mothers at church, asked me if I would join her at the market every month in Sterling, a gorgeous little town neighboring us in the Adelaide Hills. Her dad had come up with a way for Pacific Islanders to make their own coconut oil in order to generate their own income. It was a huge opportunity for them to become self-sufficient. Only thing was, they needed sales. The general public still believed that coconut oil was unhealthy. Naomi explained to me that the science behind why coconut oil was in fact the healthiest option. I couldn't really grasp it, but I loved the texture of it, and I knew that if Naomi deemed something kosher, it was. Thankfully, she would be with me at the market and explain the scientific facts while I was there for support and to give customers free hand massages. It was so much fun, and it gave me an opportunity to do what I loved the most, chatting to strangers. Naomi's dad was very grateful for our small but heartfelt contribution. Every sale made a difference at this point, as coconut oil was received with such skepticism, and I loved knowing that I could help Pacific Islanders generate an income. Another friend, Becky, also wanted me to help her with an idea she had. Adelaide was starting to receive more and more asylum seekers. Would I be interested in coming along for a weekly catch-up in the city to help Iranian Iraqi mothers learn English? Of course. The word spread in the community, and it wasn't long before we had about 12 mothers and their children meeting in a conference room at the immigration office in the city. Asher and Tikva would join me to hang out with the ladies who don't speak English and play with the other children under the tables as the mothers would drink cups of tea and try to learn all the new concepts of life in Adelaide. I really felt for them. I knew how hard and isolating it was to be in a new place, even without already knowing the language. It felt so good to be able to support someone else in the same process. As it turned out, our little group grew very quickly, and it wasn't long before we were offered a space in a council building in the northern suburbs. We could become a proper playgroup where we had activities for the children and toys to play with, a much friendlier environment for all of us. Despite the language barrier, our friendships deepened, and we started getting more and more offers of having meals at different homes. Asher and Tikva got used to us driving to new parts of Adelaide and being welcomed into homes where the evening meal wasn't served until very late at night, way past their bedtime, and we would sit on carpets while being served huge amounts of fragrant rice and perfectly cooked spicy meats. The generosity of these families was so overwhelming because I knew from helping them with their banking how little they were surviving on each week. Yet they were wanting to shower us with their hospitality. Not long after my marriage ended, I heard there was a new sourdough bakery not far from us. Hahndorf was a German tourist town, and they now had a bakery run by an Israeli. I was intrigued. I got to know the owner and his partner, and it wasn't long before I started to sell bread for them. I would do taste testing in shops that catered for health-conscious people. The organic market in Stirling, a gourmet food shop in Burnside, as well as a couple of stalls at the central markets. It was lots of fun, and I loved getting paid for talking and feeding bread to strangers. What could be better? It was during one of these mornings at the central markets when a lady came up to me to taste the bread. Everything about her reminded me of my mother. I had to ask her, was she Swedish? She was, and absolutely thrilled to hear that I was as well, and laughed when I told her that I was also from Israel. She insisted that I come over to her house. Tineke wanted me to meet her daughter, who was an artist, and Danny, her boyfriend, an author, and their quirky group of friends. I visited a couple of days later, and after 5 years in Adelaide, I felt as if I had finally met some like-minded people. Eccentric and whimsical, and most importantly, ridiculously silly. I didn't get to see them very often, but when I did, it recharged my batteries. Thankfully, they invited me to spend Christmas with them. I had already booked in to do dishes for a church lunch for the homeless in the city, while Asher and Tikva went to their grandparents' house with Paul. Spending Christmas Eve with this eclectic Swedish group was the closest I could come to being home for Christmas, and I was so grateful for the invite. I was struggling more and more with the people at my church, or maybe they were struggling with me. Not much was said about my new status of being a single woman, but I could feel their disapproval. Quite a lot of the church community stopped talking to me altogether. Others clumsily tried to tell me that they were praying for me. I had one well-meaning woman at church take my hands and stare into my eyes and tell me that I had made a very bad decision marrying Paul. Actually, a very, very bad decision. Really? I had made a bad decision? What about the decisions Paul had made? It was so frustrating. I didn't want to engage with it. People would see what they wanted to see. I didn't feel the need to tell people what had happened in our marriage. It was too complex. And with Paul still teaching at the college and working at the radio station, I didn't think everyone needed to know the sordid details. It was quite strange, though. I had gone from being a preacher's wife to a single mother. In Christian circles, I had gone from the top of the ladder to the bottom very quickly. I had lost my status that I never realized I had until it was gone. Strangely, it felt so much better on the bottom. Only weeks before our marriage ended, Paul and I had organized a Passover meal at our church, and over 50 people came along. We ate roast lamb and Middle Eastern food, and Paul spoke about the symbolism of the Passover meal. He explained how the Lord's Supper, or communion, as many call it, and drinking the wine and eating the bread that represents the blood and flesh of Jesus actually stems from the Passover meal. How Jesus was celebrating this annual ritual with his closest friends and holding up the cup of wine that represented the salvation of the Israelites out of Egypt, and having the audacity to say that this cup was actually his blood, that his blood was the salvation of Israel. Then taking the bread that was the symbol of God's redemption of the Israelites, the bread that showed God's provision, Jesus now saying that this unleavened bread was his body. The whole of the Passover Seder points to Jesus as the Messiah, and Paul explained the symbols throughout the meal. It shed new light on the communion that so many Christians partake of without knowing the Jewish roots behind it, and not realizing that it's woven into the Hebrew ritual of the Passover meal. It was a huge eye-opener for the people in our church, and we had so many of them come up and ask for more information and explaining that they had never looked at the New Testament in the context of Judaism before. Some even said they had never even thought about Jesus being Jewish, or that there was any connection between the two. Months after my marriage ended, I still had people coming up to me asking when Paul and I would have another Jewish event at the church. They were refusing to believe that we were actually no longer together. Others were making comments about how happy I seemed. I got the feeling it bothered them. I tried to keep going to church, despite it feeling more and more awkward. It was still the only community I had and the closest thing I had to family in Australia. I struggled with so many aspects of church. I tried to ignore them and put my energies into the things I valued and not focus on their requests for money to be given to their building fund. One of the men at church, who I really respected for his social justice outlook, asked if there were people who were interested in joining him on Saturdays to teach English to Afghani asylum seekers who were working in an abattoir. A local church had offered a space to be used so that the men didn't have to try and find transport for the 45-minute drive to the city where the closest English classes were. I was keen to help. I knew what a difference it had made for the women I was helping out to have English speakers spend time with them, so I quickly said that I would be happy to come as long as they were okay for me to bring my children. As it turned out, having Asher and Tikva there was perfect. These men, many of them dads, had fled their country for safety, leaving their wives and children in order to save their lives. They were Hazaras, a persecuted ethnic group from the mountains of Afghanistan. They told me in their very broken English how their fathers and brothers were murdered and they were next. Many of them had escaped with only hours to plan. Most of these men came from rural villages without running water or electricity and with no concept of the world around them. They had never even been to a city before, let alone left their country. As they arrived at their next destination while fleeing, they were only given instructions on where to go next, and many didn't even realize they were in Australia until they were told upon arrival. My heart went out to these men who were now thrilled to have some kids to play with. They carried Asher and Tikva on their shoulders and chased them around the room. Quite a few people from the church had come along to help out, so we were split into groups. I was partnered with a man who introduced himself as Peter, a local minister. We spent the afternoon teaching English, and both of us realizing very quickly that the workbooks were useless, and it was much better to just make conversation. These men needed more than grammar and spelling. They needed to connect and be heard. We quickly became a very animated table and tried our hardest to not draw too much attention to our group. Peter and I would grin at each other across the table. We were having so much fun with this lively group of men. Over the next few days, I kept thinking back to Peter. There was something really special about him. For a minister, he was very relaxed and informal. He was also witty and very kind. None of the usual ego I would associate ministers to have. He had mentioned to me that he was single. Had he purposely done that, or was it an innocent piece of information? I had to acknowledge that I was really attracted to him. It didn't take long before Peter and I would meet together without our Afghan friends. Peter was beautiful, 24 years older than me, and absolutely beautiful. He adored me, really adored me. I had never had that attention like this before from a man. He was kind and attentive and made me feel desired. He knew that I couldn't sleep with him. That was a boundary I still couldn't cross with my marriage still not legally over. I needed the divorce to come through before I could even consider being intimate with a man. Peter didn't mind. He showered me with the love that I was so starved of. He would cook for me or hug me while I prepared a meal for us in his kitchen. Then he would dance me across the room to music from the 50s. He brought me flowers just because and told me I looked like a movie starlet. He was exactly what my raw wounded heart needed. Years of neglect were being wiped away by a sweet minister who seemed to understand my heartache and pain. He took me to his little hobby farm as we drove around in his ute, delivering straw to his cattle. He would tell me about his trips around the world and how much he longed to return. We sat by his dam, admiring the weeping willow he had planted, and we discussed theology and the loneliness of marriage. A couple of months later, we invited our Afghan friends to spend an evening with us on the farm. They all jumped into the back of the ute and laughed as Peter drove them up and down the hilly paddocks, looking for logs for our fire. They were so curious and wanted to know everything, pointing to trees and asking for the proper name. What was the word for the car we were in? The Aussie term ute, totally new for them. As we got into one of the paddocks, Mohammed stepped into a fresh cow patty. Everyone roared with laughter. What is this name? What you call this? Peter started to say cow dung, but I interjected with a more appropriate word. Shit. This is shit. They looked at each other. Shit. They knew this word. They had heard it at the abattoir. Mohammed looked across to the neighboring paddock and pointed to the bull. A light went on in his eyes. Bull. Shit. Bullshit. Bullshit! He finally understood. He was jubilant. So were the rest of the guys. The English language had just come alive for them. They all started chanting, bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. Asher and Tikva joining in. This mystery word finally had meaning. We then had a wonderful evening around the fire, cooking meat and singing songs, but nothing quite beat the moment in the paddock when a group of lonely Hazara men finally understood the true meaning of bullshit. When Paul announced he was taking our car, I didn't need to worry. Peter had one that I was able to buy off him very cheaply. It felt so good to be looked after and be on the receiving end of someone who genuinely cared for me in such practical ways. This was completely new for me. Peter was the best thing that could have happened to my heart those first few months after my marriage ended. I hadn't even been looking for a relationship at all. I was still in shock at finding myself single. Divorce was only something that happened to other people. It was never going to happen to me, ever. As much as I wanted to focus on my unexpected romance, I had some serious decisions to make. I had to complete my studies so I was able to get a proper job. The only way I could study was to put Tikva into childcare. As a stay-at-home mother, the idea of childcare was completely out of my reality. It felt wrong on so many levels. I also needed to earn a wage. Even a little bit of money would help. I was trying to encourage Paul to have the kids for a few hours each week, but he wasn't really interested. He told me it was too hard to have both of the kids. I explained that they would feel distressed about being split up from each other. Asher and Tikva were always together. Paul finally agreed to have them for a few hours every Sunday afternoon. So I approached the organic market in Sterling and asked them if I could get a waitressing job there. They had gotten to know me from my bread tastings I had done. Thankfully, they gave me a Sunday shift. I was so grateful. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help me pay for extra expenses. I had never been an academic person, but I now had a huge incentive. I needed to get a proper job and start my career. My mind boggled at the thought of me, Veronica Sherman, being a single mother with 2 children and a career woman. That was so far from the image my heart was set on, being a wife and hopefully mother of 4. My new life was so busy, but in my quiet moments I was still grieving the loss of not being the mother of a large family and not being a wife. I had to accept my new status and move on. Paul seemed to be keen for me to move on as well. One Sunday when I dropped off the kids, he asked me if I had made any long-term plans. I told him about my studies and how I was hoping to maybe open up a counseling center in Adelaide with some classmates. Paul asked if I had considered moving to Sweden. Sweden? No, I hadn't. Paul said I really should. That way I could be close to my parents again and get the support I needed. He went on to say that Sweden would be better financially for me and it would mean having my parents there to help me out. They had recently moved there unexpectedly after their very long stay in the U.S. A few months earlier, my dad had been out for his regular early morning prayer walk, as he called it. He would wake up at 4 a.m. and walk for a couple of hours. For him, a perfect opportunity to get fresh air as well as pray. He loved his daily ritual and enjoyed the empty streets. One morning, though, he didn't return. He'd been found on the side of the road by a passing jogger in a pool of blood. He was rushed to hospital, and the doctors weren't sure if he would survive or not. 2 drunk teenagers had been looking for something fun to do after a late-night party. They had a metal baseball bat with them. As my father walked past them in deep in prayer, they whacked him as hard as they could on the back of his head. He crumpled to the ground, and the 2 teenagers took off thinking they had just killed a man. The people in Springfield, where my parents were living, were shocked as the news spread about the brutal attack. How could something like this happen? Word got out that the victim was a Jew from Jerusalem, a Jew that was studying at one of their Christian seminaries. It was almost as if Jesus himself had been attacked on their streets. Money started pouring in as my dad lay in the hospital bed in a coma. There were so many strangers wanting to help, my dad's story triggering an outpouring of love from the local community. The donations covered the outrageous hospital expenses. That in itself was a modern-day miracle. Not just that, though. But there was enough money for my parents to finally leave America. My mother had been wanting to spend more time with her parents as they were aging quickly. Once my dad was strong enough to travel, they packed up their belongings yet again and moved to Sweden. 3 months later, more died. Now Paul was suggesting that I move to Sweden as well. It seemed ludicrous. I had been hoping that Paul would be trying to spend more time with his children, encouraging him to have them overnight, attempt to build a relationship with them. It had taken Asher and Tikva over a year to even ask where he was, his absence not even noticed for such a long time. I wanted my kids to have a relationship with their dad, and here he was telling me I should move to Sweden with them. I told them I wouldn't, that we were staying in Adelaide and that our kids need a dad. Paul seemed disappointed with my response. A couple of weeks later, his request made more sense. He let it slip that he had reconnected with an old girlfriend who lived in Sydney and was hoping to move there and start a new life. It was hard enough to understand his lack of interest in me as his wife, but to realize he was so flippant about his own kids really hurt. I knew he loved them. He really did. Adored them, in fact, and his face would light up when he saw them. He just couldn't care for them. He was so wrapped up in his own pursuits that being a father felt like too much effort. I ached for my children. I wanted them to have a dad so badly. My life was incredibly busy. I was juggling my studies, waitressing, teaching English to the Hazara men, helping with the playgroup for the asylum-seeking mothers, doing the occasional taste testing for the bakery, running fun events for the church, and helping Alice out as much as I could with her huge work commitments. She now had 4 young kids and was still working as a voice instructor at an acting school. I had ended things with Peter because I just couldn't give any proper time to our relationship. It was during this incredibly hectic season that my mother was able to come and visit me for the first time. She loved the Australian scenery and marveled at our exotic birds. Life had not been easy for her for the past few years, and her trip to Australia was a breath of fresh air. My dad decided that he wanted to come and visit me as well. I was surprised because he hadn't showed much interest in my life at all. He was still very upset with me for leaving Paul, and most of our contact since my divorce was very brief. My dad had really connected with Paul and respected his preaching and biblical teachings. He still couldn't fully comprehend why I had left my husband and was constantly reminding me that divorce was in direct opposition to God's commands and his covenant. Yet now he was saying that he was coming to visit me. The day before he was meant to fly out, I got a call from my mother. My dad had suffered yet another heart attack, and he was in a coma. His trip obviously cancelled. My poor dad. He had only recently recovered from the baseball bashing, still not able to taste or smell from the head injury. Now he was in a hospital again. Once he was well enough to talk, he asked that I fly to Sweden instead with the kids. He would pay. He was now a pastor for an international church with a tiny income. Yet he wanted to pay for us to fly over. He was so generous. He always had been. But it still really touched me that he was able to give so freely even in such difficult circumstances. The timing was perfect with our visit to Sweden. My brother Sam was visiting with his wife Carla and their 2 kids, and we had a great time in Falsterbo together. Taking bike rides to the beach and having our kids play together for the first time, I finally had a taste of what it would be like for my children to have cousins. My youngest brother Ezra decided to come and visit Dad as well, and brought his girlfriend Lydia with him. The kids adored her gentle and sweet nature. Incredibly, Susanna was able to fly over from Egypt as well with her son, so before we knew it, we had a spontaneous family reunion. My dad loved having his kids come into the hospital to visit and having some time with each grandchild. Unfortunately, Abigail, my younger sister, was unable to join us because she had made plans to visit me in Australia before Dad had the heart attack. When she realized she couldn't change her tickets from the States, she decided to fly to Cairns and wait there until I flew back to Adelaide with the kids. While I was away in Sweden, I organized with the church to move into the manse next door. It was available for new tenants, and thankfully they agreed to let me rent it. Their only concern was that I might not pay the rent on time like previous tenants had, and made it very clear to me that this was not a private arrangement through the church. It was a completely official contract with the real estate agent. I was more than happy to agree to that and made sure that any issues went through the agent and kept the church out of the equation. It seemed fair enough. I could understand their concern. Once we had returned from Sweden and gotten over our jet lag, we moved into our new home. The church manse was a great house with a huge backyard. We were thrilled. Only a few days later, Abigail flew from Cairns to join us. Life seemed to be on track. I was less than 2 months away from turning 30. My bachelor's degree was only a few assignments away from being finished, and some of my classmates were already looking around for a place we could start rent together for a counseling hub. After a few weeks earlier in the year of dabbling in the murky waters of online dating, the dating scene, I had decided that I needed to set aside any hope of repartnering and accept the fact that I was going to be a single career woman with 2 children. I had spent about 6 months feeling like a dark cloud was over me, but I was finally starting to make peace with my new reality. I decided that on my 30th birthday, I would declare my new decade as my abstinence decade. I had 2 kids and a career to focus on. No time for romance.